Hello guys, welcome back to my channel. A channel that discusses very dramatic movie stories, guys. In this video, I'll take you to watch a very dramatic movie about this story entitled The Luna's Second Choice. Before this story begins, don't forget to hit subscribe and like. Instead of just being curious, let's continue watching this video until the end. Okay? 10 years ago, an orphaned girl named Alara saved Alpha Mason of the Stormfin Pack using her rare healing blood. To repay her, he took her in as his adopted daughter, promising her that when she came of age, she could marry any of his 5 sons, and her chosen husband would become the next Alpha for a decade. Alara was devoted to the strongest son, Ethan, and fully intended to choose him to rule by his side. However, everything changes when a manipulative Omega maid named Jenny joins the pack. The 5 brothers, including Ethan, become completely infatuated with Jenny, ignoring Alara and constantly taking Jenny's side. Tired of their disrespect and profound heartbreak, Alara decides she won't marry any of them. Instead, she secretly agrees to a marriage alliance with Xavier Lockhart, a powerful and mysterious Lycan prince known for being ruthless and living in the shadows. Alpha Mason completely supports her brave decision. Unaware of her new engagement, the 5 brothers continue to mistreat Alara. They assume she is just throwing a tantrum for attention and fully expect her to still pick one of them. Things reach a boiling point when Jenny fakes a severe injury, and Ethan viciously forces Alara to use her healing blood to save Jenny, draining her until she loses consciousness. At her 18th birthday banquet, the brothers suddenly realize Alara is their fated mate, but the realization comes far too late as she is about to announce her engagement to the Lycan prince. The dense, ancient forest of the Stormfin Pack territory was a place of deep shadows and whispering pines, a realm where a young, terrified orphan girl named Alara once wandered completely alone. 10 years ago, the damp earth beneath her bare feet was freezing, and the haunting howls of distant predators echoed through the terrifying darkness. It was in this unforgiving wilderness that fate intervened, leading her trembling steps toward the heavily wounded figure of Alpha Mason. He was bleeding profusely from a toxic silver wound, his life force rapidly draining into the cold mud. Driven by a pure innate instinct to heal, the young girl offered her own rare miraculous blood, a divine gift blessed by the moon goddess herself, completely saving the powerful pack leader from the absolute brink of certain death. Alpha Mason, deeply overwhelmed by the miraculous healing properties of this mysterious orphan child, immediately recognized the immense value and profound divinity running through her veins. He swore a solemn oath to the moon goddess that he would protect her from the harsh, cruel world that had abandoned her. Bringing her back to the sprawling, heavily fortified grounds of the Stormfin Pack, he publicly declared that she would be raised exactly like his own flesh and blood. The pack members, awestruck by her angelic nature and the Alpha's decree, bowed their heads in deep reverence. For the first time in her incredibly tragic, lonely existence, little Alara felt the warm, comforting embrace of a true home, completely unaware of the devastating heartbreak that awaited her in the distant future. Within the massive stone walls of the Alpha's grand estate, Alara was formally introduced to the 5 young boys who would eventually become the absolute center of her universe. Alpha Mason lined up his 5 strong, fiercely competitive sons, declaring to the entire household that when Alara finally reached her 18th birthday, she would be granted the ultimate privilege of choosing her husband from among them. The son she selected would be elevated above his brothers, instantly succeeding Mason as the supreme alpha of the Stormfin Pack. It was an arrangement born of deep gratitude and strategic wisdom, designed to bind her miraculous healing blood permanently to their powerful royal bloodline. Among the 5 boisterous, highly competitive brothers, one immediately stood out and completely captured the innocent heart of the young orphaned girl. Ethan, the eldest and undeniably the strongest of the quintet, possessed a fierce protective aura that deeply drew Alara to him like a moth to a brilliant burning flame. Throughout their childhood, Ethan was her constant shadow, aggressively defending her from any minor threat and showering her with a profound, intoxicating attention that made her feel like the most cherished creature on the entire earth. She naively believed that his fierce protectiveness was a clear, undeniable manifestation of true, everlasting love, firmly cementing her lifelong intention to choose him as her husband. For 10 long, beautiful years, the grand illusion of their unbreakable bond remained perfectly, flawlessly intact. Alara dedicated her entire existence to becoming the perfect Luna, diligently studying pack politics, mastering ancient werewolf traditions, and constantly utilizing her highly draining healing blood to cure sick and injured members of the Stormfin pack. Every single sacrifice she made, every drop of blood she willingly shed, was done with the comforting, deeply embedded certainty that Ethan would one day stand proudly by her side. She visualized their glorious future together, entirely convinced that the profound connection they shared was an absolute, indestructible force forged by the very hands of the moon goddess herself. However, the magnificent, carefully constructed paradise of her childhood was violently shattered exactly 1 year ago, on a day that would forever alter the tragic trajectory of her life. While patrolling the outer borders of the dense forest, the 5 brothers stumbled upon a seemingly fragile, highly manipulative rogue Omega named Jenny. During a chaotic scuffle, Jenny sustained a minor injury, and the brothers, completely overwhelmed by an inexplicable, unnatural protective instinct, immediately rushed her back to the pack house. From the exact moment that ordinary, unremarkable maid stepped across the threshold of their home, the profound, decade-long bond between Alara and the brothers began to aggressively and permanently decay. The shift in the brothers' behavior was not subtle. It was a devastating, incredibly rapid avalanche of emotional betrayal. Ethan, the man who had sworn 1,000 times to protect Alara from any harm, suddenly had absolutely no time for her. His dark, intense eyes, which used to soften only for Alara, were now constantly searching the room for the fragile Omega maid. The brothers tripped over themselves to cater to Jenny's every single pathetic whim, completely ignoring the woman who had spent 10 years bleeding and sacrificing for their family. Alara was violently thrust aside, entirely forgotten in the blinding, highly toxic infatuation that had completely consumed the minds of her 5 supposed protectors. The absolute soul-crushing confirmation of her worst, most terrifying fears occurred entirely by accident on a quiet, deeply painful afternoon. Walking silently through the grand corridors of the pack house, Alara inadvertently overheard a conversation that would permanently freeze the blood in her veins. She heard Ethan's deep, familiar voice, confessing to Jenny that no woman had ever made his wolf lose control like she did. He explicitly, unapologetically stated that Jenny was the absolute only she-wolf he truly wanted to mark and marry. The decade of devotion, the promise to his father, the years of shared childhood memories, Ethan callously dismissed it all, claiming his impending marriage to Alara was nothing more than a forced, suffocating obligation to appease Alpha Mason. Standing frozen in the dark shadows of the hallway, Alara felt her entire heart physically shatter into a million jagged, unfixable pieces. The sheer unadulterated cruelty of Ethan's words, validating Jenny's scent over hers, was a profound, agonizing dagger straight to her chest. She realized with terrifying, absolute clarity that the 10 incredibly loyal years she had spent unconditionally loving them meant significantly less than the single highly manipulative year they had spent fawning over a lowly maid. The profound humiliation of being nothing more than an obligatory chore, a mere political stepping stone to the alpha title, completely destroyed the fragile, innocent girl who had once loved them so blindly. Wiping the hot, bitter tears of supreme betrayal from her pale cheeks, Elara made a silent, monumental vow to the moon goddess in that dark corridor. If her feelings were not genuinely reciprocated, if her absolute presence was merely a forced, heavy burden upon the men she loved, she would unconditionally refuse to stand in their way. She possessed significantly too much pride, too much inherent royal dignity, to pathetically beg for the leftover scraps of their fractured affection. She would completely reject the arrangement, entirely withdrawing herself from the incredibly toxic, highly humiliating competition for Ethan's heart, firmly deciding that she would absolutely not marry any of the 5 ungrateful brothers. Driven by her newfound deeply fierce resolve, Elara requested an immediate, highly private audience with Alpha Mason in his grand, oak-paneled study. Standing tall and completely unwavering before the man who had raised her, she firmly declared her absolute non-negotiable decision to reject his 5 sons. She revealed the existence of a highly secretive, incredibly powerful marriage proposal she had quietly received from the formidable Lycan prince, Xavier Lockhart. The proposal from the ultimate, supreme ruler of the new generation was a massive, highly strategic alliance that would instantly elevate her far beyond the petty, highly toxic drama of the Stormfin Pack's internal politics. Alpha Mason was visibly shocked by the sudden, highly dramatic revelation, his aged eyes widening at the mention of the notoriously ruthless Lycan prince. Xavier Lockhart was a terrifying, highly mysterious figure who lived entirely in the deep shadows. A man so incredibly isolated that hardly anyone in the modern werewolf world had ever truly seen his face. The Alpha questioned if she truly wanted to bind her life to a man surrounded by such dark, terrifying legends. However, Elara remained completely steadfast, arguing that Xavier's highly secure borders, his deeply peaceful territory, and his absolute, unyielding power proved he was a fine, highly capable leader, and therefore an incredibly worthy choice for a husband. Respecting the profound, undeniable strength and highly mature wisdom in his adopted daughter's voice, Alpha Mason solemnly agreed to her massive life-altering request. He promised to keep the monumental royal alliance completely quiet for the time being, specifically hiding the explosive truth from Ethan and the other deeply arrogant brothers. The Alpha sighed heavily, expressing a deep, profound regret that absolutely none of his 5 foolish boys were ultimately worthy of her incredibly pure, divine heart. With her adoptive father's full, unwavering support secured, Elara walked out of the study feeling completely liberated. The heavy, suffocating chains of her unrequited love finally, permanently shattered. Completely oblivious to the massive, highly secretive royal alliance that had just been forged in the Alpha study, the 5 brothers continued to display a sickening, highly arrogant level of entitlement. They cornered Elara in the grand living room, aggressively demanding to know which one of them she was finally going to choose. They mocked her silence, entirely convinced that she was simply playing a pathetic, highly messed up psychological game to drag out the suspense and screw with their heads. Their profound arrogance blinded them to the cold, absolute detachment that had entirely replaced the warm, adoring gaze she used to reserve solely for them. Elara looked at the 5 tall, physically imposing brothers with a profound, icy indifference that deeply unsettled the wolves hiding just beneath their skin. She calmly, clearly announced that her 18th birthday was only 1 week away, and she would officially reveal her chosen fiancé at the grand birthday banquet. The brothers aggressively scoffed at her words, thoroughly annoyed by the unnecessary delay. They loudly complained that whoever she inevitably picked would just be forcefully pushed into the marriage by their father anyway, incredibly oblivious to the fact that they had already lost her completely, undeniably, and permanently to a vastly superior man. The deeply toxic, highly volatile atmosphere in the pack house was constantly, aggressively fueled by the manipulative Omega maid, Jenny. Seeing an opportunity to further humiliate Alara, Jenny boldly stepped out of line, mockingly asking if the young miss was greedily planning to keep all 5 handsome alphas entirely for herself. It was a vile, deeply disrespectful comment designed specifically to paint Alara as a selfish, attention-seeking brat in front of the men. Alara, no longer the timid, deeply heartbroken girl she was yesterday, immediately fired back, coldly reminding the pathetic maid that a lowly Omega had absolutely zero right to question the highly esteemed, adopted daughter of the reigning Alpha. Instead of recognizing the sheer absolute truth of Alara's words, the brothers immediately, aggressively rushed to defend the highly manipulative maid. They viciously attacked Alara, yelling that she was getting incredibly full of herself just because their father spoiled her. They hurled deeply painful, highly unforgivable insults, cruelly reminding her that she was nothing more than a pathetic, worthless orphan they had generously taken in off the filthy streets. They accused her of being a twisted, highly toxic attention whore who maliciously enjoyed keeping them wrapped around her finger, completely entirely blind to the highly toxic, deeply pathetic reality of their own blinding infatuation. The relentless, highly coordinated emotional abuse continued daily, completely orchestrated by the venomous maid who thrived on the brothers' blind protection. Jenny escalated her deeply wicked games, intentionally planting Alpha Mason's favorite, incredibly expensive watch in her own belongings, and loudly accusing Alara of framing her as a lowly thief. Jenny fake cried with Oscar-worthy perfection, claiming that Alara was insanely jealous of the young Alpha's affection and was resorting to deeply evil, highly vindictive sabotage. Without a single shred of actual evidence, the brothers instantly believed the sobbing maid, aggressively threatening Alara and warning her to stay far away from Jenny if she ever wanted to marry one of them. The sheer, unadulterated absurdity of their hollow threats was profoundly laughable to a woman who had already secured a royal marriage to a Lycan prince. When Alara genuinely felt deeply ill and asked Ethan to escort her to the pack hospital, he coldly, aggressively refused. He stated that they had previously promised to take precious little Jenny to the exclusive hot springs that evening. He viciously accused Alara of faking her sickness entirely for attention, telling her that her pathetic little act was not going to work on them anymore. The absolute, deeply chilling lack of basic human empathy completely validated Alara's decision to abandon them to their highly toxic, pathetic delusions. Realizing that absolutely no matter what she did or said, they would invariably blindly side with the innocent acting maid, Alara completely dropped her polite facade. She was entirely done holding back, completely done playing the silent, suffering victim. When Jenny intentionally threw herself to the hard floor and loudly screamed in fake agony, desperately framing Alara for a physical assault, the brothers erupted in a terrifying, highly aggressive rage. They screamed at Alara, calling her a twisted, cruel monster for supposedly lashing out at an innocent Omega simply because she was desperately jealous. Ethan, completely blinded by his raging, incredibly stupid wolf instincts, aggressively cornered Alara, his deep voice dripping with pure, unadulterated disgust. He venomously declared that he would absolutely never marry her if his father wasn't aggressively forcing the arrangement upon him, adding that simply looking at her face made his skin physically crawl. Alara did not flinch, cry, or beg. She stared directly into his dark, furious eyes with a completely calm, incredibly icy detachment and smoothly replied that it was perfectly fine, because she had absolutely never planned to marry him anyways, shattering his deeply inflated ego with an absolute, undeniable truth. The brothers were momentarily stunned by her profound, highly unexpected emotional detachment. Ethan aggressively accused her of desperately trying to guilt-trip them with her ancient, deeply annoying saving the alpha story. In a pathetic display of extreme arrogance, he told her he would begrudgingly agree to marry her, but strictly on the absolute condition that she swear to never, ever hurt precious Jenny again. Alara simply laughed a cold, highly humorless laugh, looking at the man she once adored as if he were a completely insane, utterly pathetic stranger. She clearly, firmly reiterated that she was entirely, absolutely not marrying a single one of them. As Alara gracefully walked away from the incredibly toxic, highly chaotic scene, a tiny, deeply unsettling seed of severe doubt finally began to quietly sprout in Ethan's arrogant mind. Something about her deeply profound, highly icy detachment felt incredibly different this time. He wondered if she actually, genuinely did not want to marry him. However, his incredibly massive ego quickly crushed the fleeting doubt. He convinced himself that she was merely throwing a highly dramatic, incredibly desperate theatrical tantrum to force his hand, entirely certain that she had absolutely no other viable options and would inevitably cave and choose him at the grand banquet. Miles away, hidden deep within the impenetrable shadows of a massive, heavily fortified royal fortress, the legendary Lycan prince Xavier Lockhart sat upon his obsidian throne. He found the entire situation incredibly fascinating. He was a man deeply feared by the entire werewolf world, a highly ruthless, incredibly deadly ruler whose mere name struck pure terror into the hearts of veteran alphas. Yet, this relatively unknown adopted daughter of the Stormfin Pack had bravely, completely willingly accepted his highly secretive marriage proposal. He smiled a dark, highly incredibly intriguing smile, commanding his most trusted guard to immediately deliver his royal Lunas crest to the Stormfin Pack. Back at the Stormfin Pack house, preparations for the grand, highly anticipated werewolf fall ball were in absolute, highly chaotic full swing. The royal dressmaker arrived to present Alara with a breathtaking, incredibly exclusive haute couture gown specifically designed to ensure she would be the absolute center of attention. The exquisite dress was a masterpiece of intricate lacework and flowing silk, perfectly complementing her deeply radiant, highly aristocratic beauty. However, the deeply peaceful, highly exciting moment was violently interrupted when Ethan aggressively barged into the fitting room, completely accompanied by the incredibly smug, highly manipulative Omega maid, Jenny. Ethan had incredibly callously asked the lowly Omega maid to be his official date to the highly prestigious ball, completely flaunting his deeply insulting choice right in front of Alora's face. He aggressively demanded that Alora hand over her stunning, highly exclusive custom dress so that Jenny could wear it instead. He arrogantly assumed that since Alara supposedly had absolutely no date for the evening, she wouldn't even be attending the ball. Alara's eyes narrowed with a highly lethal, deeply icy fury. She stood her ground with profound, absolute authority, firmly telling him that the magnificent dress was strictly hers and she was absolutely not surrendering it to a manipulative thief. Jenny, executing her highly practiced, deeply manipulative victim routine flawlessly, immediately began to fake cry. She whimpered pathetically, heavily playing the deeply oppressed Omega card, claiming she would absolutely never dare take something the highly esteemed Miss Alara wanted. Ethan, completely falling for the sickeningly sweet act, fiercely comforted the maid, glaring at Alara with pure unadulterated hatred. He loudly promised Jenny that he would buy her absolutely anything she wanted, aggressively treating the woman who had saved his family like absolute, highly disposable garbage to elevate the deeply manipulative maid. The sheer, incredibly toxic audacity of Ethan's actions completely solidified Alara's absolute lack of regret. She watched them leave the fitting room with a deep, profound sense of highly liberating relief. She realized that she had dodged a massive, highly destructive bullet by not legally binding her soul to a man so incredibly weak-minded that he could be flawlessly manipulated by a few fake, highly pathetic tears. She turned back to the mirror, admiring the deeply radiant, highly powerful woman staring back at her, entirely ready to completely dominate the grand ball and heavily prepare for her impending royal elevation. The absolute climax of their deeply horrific, highly abusive behavior occurred just days before her highly anticipated birthday. In a deeply orchestrated, highly manipulative stunt designed to secure the brothers' absolute sympathy, Jenny intentionally injured herself. The brothers panicked completely, acting as if the fragile maid had sustained a highly fatal, deeply catastrophic wound. Ethan aggressively stormed into Alara's private bedroom, completely demanding that she immediately use her rare, highly draining healing blood to cure his precious maid. Alara, completely disgusted by their profound, highly toxic lack of conscience, absolutely and firmly refused to waste her divine gift on a deeply manipulative liar. Ethan's reaction to her completely justified refusal was one of sheer, unadulterated madness. He violently grabbed her arm, completely ignoring her own physical weakness and deep, lingering injuries. He aggressively shouted that unlike Alara, who was supposedly born with the highly durable ability to heal herself, precious little Jenny was just a highly fragile, incredibly delicate omega who absolutely could not handle the physical pain. In a deeply pathetic, highly manipulative attempt to force her hand, Ethan explicitly promised that if she agreed to completely save Jenny, he would officially agree to marry her, treating his absolute commitment like a cheap, highly transactional bargaining chip. Alara looked at the calculating, highly aggressive madman gripping her arm with pure, unadulterated disgust. She fiercely yanked her arm away, firmly stating that Jenny had intentionally hurt herself and she would absolutely never, ever waste a single precious drop of her divine blood on her. She loudly reminded Ethan that she had already firmly, explicitly refused to marry him, so his highly pathetic, incredibly arrogant bargaining chip was completely, utterly worthless. The brothers, completely enraged by her profound, highly unyielding defiance, aggressively surrounded her, screaming that if she selfishly refused, absolutely none of them would ever marry her. In a highly terrifying, deeply abusive escalation of pure violence, Ethan completely lost his mind. When another brother burst into the room claiming that Jenny was supposedly struggling in bed and dramatically saying she wanted to die from a simple headache, Ethan aggressively seized Alara by force. Ignoring her desperate, highly frantic screams for him to stop, he violently dragged the struggling, deeply terrified girl down the heavy stone hallways to Jenny's bedroom. He aggressively restrained her, holding her down with his massive, highly overwhelming werewolf strength, completely prioritizing a fake headache over the deep, profound physical trauma he was heavily inflicting upon his adopted sister. With a cold, deeply ruthless precision, Ethan aggressively slashed Alara's delicate wrist. The highly rare, deeply miraculous blood began to flow rapidly, entirely siphoned off to heal the minor, completely superficial scratches on Jenny's arm. Jenny lay on the bed, looking at Alara with a deeply sinister, highly victorious smirk while simultaneously fake crying and thanking Ethan for being so incredibly good to her. Alara screamed in profound, highly agonizing pain, begging Ethan to stop as the extreme, incredibly rapid blood loss began to severely affect her physical body. Her vision blurred aggressively, the entire room spinning wildly as her life force was violently drained away. Even when Jenny's minor wounds were entirely healed, the deeply manipulative maid dramatically claimed she still felt slightly dizzy. Instead of stopping the highly dangerous, deeply traumatic bloodletting, Ethan coldly forced Alara to continue bleeding. A terrified pack doctor desperately warned the young Alpha that Miss Alara looked incredibly terrible, explicitly stating that she had lost significantly too much blood and would absolutely die if the violent draining continued. Ethan completely, arrogantly dismissed the professional medical warning, claiming he intimately knew Alara's limits and that she would be entirely fine. As the dark, heavy shadows of unconsciousness rapidly pulled her under, Alara faintly heard the brothers aggressively mocking her. They called her a stupid, highly pathetic orphan, cruelly stating that her own biological parents had absolutely never wanted her. Jenny aggressively leaned in, violently warning Alara to completely back off or she would profoundly regret it. Ethan softly whispered to Jenny, promising that no one would ever be able to hurt her again, firmly vowing that the 5 brothers would always fiercely protect her. Alara's highly shattered mind deeply recalled his exact same promise to her years ago, realizing with profound, highly agonizing clarity that it was all a deeply massive, highly toxic lie. The absolute severe physical trauma of the aggressive, highly violent blood draining was finally too much for her fragile human body to actively endure. Alara completely lost consciousness, her incredibly pale, completely lifeless body going completely limp against the incredibly cold stone floor. Total, absolute panic finally erupted in the bloody room as the terrified doctor aggressively screamed for immediate emergency assistance. The incredibly arrogant brothers finally realized they had entirely crossed a highly dangerous, deeply fatal line. Alara was aggressively rushed to the heavily fortified pack hospital, hovering dangerously close to the absolute terrifying brink of permanent death. When Alara finally, heavily opened her deeply exhausted eyes days later in the highly sterile, blindingly white hospital room, the very first thing she saw was the deep, highly profound relief on Alpha Mason's aged face. He aggressively thanked the moon goddess for her survival, entirely unaware that it was his own 5 arrogant sons who had violently put her in the hospital bed. Alara, completely devoid of any remaining emotion for the highly toxic brothers, calmly lied, stating her collapse was absolutely nothing and that the intense physical pain was entirely gone. She refused to tell the Alpha the terrifying truth, knowing it would violently shake him to his absolute core. The deeply sterile, blindingly white walls of the pack hospital room felt incredibly suffocating as Alara slowly recovered from the highly violent blood-draining incident. Although her physical wounds were slowly healing, the profound, agonizing emotional scars inflicted by Ethan and his deeply arrogant brothers were now irrevocably etched into her tired soul. She stared blankly at the cold stone ceiling, completely devoid of any remaining affection for the men she had once loved so unconditionally. The absolute realization that they had callously prioritized a manipulative maid's fake headache over her very life was the ultimate, undeniable catalyst for her permanent emotional detachment. It was in this profound, highly quiet moment of absolute emotional clarity that a heavily cloaked figure stepped seamlessly from the dark, impenetrable shadows of her hospital room. He was an elite royal emissary sent directly from the terrifying, highly mysterious Lycan prince, Xavier Lockhart. With profound, deeply respectful reverence, the emissary presented Alara with a magnificent, incredibly ornate velvet box containing the ancient, highly powerful royal Luna crest. The emissary delivered a firm, deeply protective message from the formidable prince. The royal wedding was to be held as soon as possible, and she would forever be fiercely shielded under the absolute terrifying might of his legendary Lycan Empire. Holding the incredibly heavy, deeply symbolic royal crest in her pale hands, Alara felt a massive, deeply powerful surge of absolute, undeniable strength completely wash over her exhausted body. She firmly told the royal guard to relay a deeply profound, highly absolute message back to the Lycan prince. In exactly 3 days, at her highly anticipated, massive 18th birthday banquet, she would publicly and confidently announce their secretive, deeply monumental royal engagement to the entire werewolf world. The incredibly dark, highly painful chapter of the Stormfin Pack was aggressively, permanently closing forever, and her highly elevated royal future was finally beginning. The highly anticipated evening of her massive, incredibly extravagant 18th birthday finally arrived. The grand, expansive ballroom of the Stormfin Pack house was completely packed with hundreds of highly excited, deeply anxious wolves. The festive atmosphere was incredibly thick with profound anticipation. Pack elders whispered excitedly among themselves, deeply speculating which of the 5 handsome young alphas the miraculous healer would finally choose. They assumed she must be completely beside herself with absolute excitement, entirely unaware of the massive, highly explosive royal bombshell she was about to aggressively drop on the entire unsuspecting pack. The 5 incredibly handsome, highly arrogant brothers stood aggressively at the front of the massive crowd, looking incredibly smug and deeply confident. They were completely certain that despite the highly violent, horrific blood-draining incident, Alara was still entirely, deeply obsessed with them. They loudly joked with each other, arrogantly placing massive bets on which one of them she would pathetically choose. They fully expected her to eventually call Ethan's name, arrogantly assuming that her decade of highly profound, deeply dedicated love could never, absolutely ever be truly broken by a few highly violent, deeply abusive mistakes on their part. However, exactly as the massive, ornate grandfather clock forcefully struck the midnight hour, officially marking Alara's highly anticipated transition into a full adult, a massive biological phenomenon completely rocked the 5 brothers to their absolute core. Suddenly, an incredibly overwhelming, profoundly intoxicatingly sweet scent violently flooded their highly sensitive wolf senses. It was the absolute, undeniably powerful scent of their true fated mate. The massive, deeply aggressive realization completely paralyzed them. The scent was incredibly strong, highly overwhelming, and it was undeniably coming directly from the grand stage where Alara stood. The 5 brothers simultaneously snapped their heads toward the source of the highly intoxicating, deeply profound scent. Standing at the incredibly polished wooden podium, looking absolutely, breathtakingly radiant in her magnificent custom gown, was Alara. The terrifying realization violently crashed into their arrogant minds like a massive, destructive freight train. The woman they had deeply abused, heavily manipulated, and violently drained of blood was their absolute, divinely chosen fated mate. The incredible, monumental tragedy of their profound, deeply arrogant mistake finally became brutally, aggressively clear to them in the most agonizing way possible. For the 5 deeply horrified brothers, finding out that Alara was their true fated mate should have been a highly magical, deeply profound dream completely come true. But looking at the deeply cold, incredibly icy, absolutely detached expression completely dominating her beautiful face, they realized they were deeply trapped in an absolute, highly terrifying nightmare of their own aggressive making. Alpha Mason stepped up to the massive microphone, proudly declaring that the incredible woman who has saved countless lives was now ready to finally, completely officially announce her highly anticipated future husband to the entire deeply silent and expectant crowd. Alara gracefully stepped forward, her dark eyes entirely scanning the massive crowd until they landed directly on the 5 deeply terrified, highly panicked brothers and the deeply jealous, highly furious Omega maid standing beside them. Jenny aggressively glared at Alara, her mind completely consumed by a deeply toxic, highly arrogant assumption that Alara was about to aggressively steal her 5 highly devoted men away. Jenny completely failed to realize that Alara absolutely, entirely didn't want them anymore. With an incredibly steady, profoundly powerful voice, Alara prepared to completely and utterly shatter their entire arrogant world. Without further ado, Alara announced, her voice completely echoing flawlessly through the absolute, deeply silent grand ballroom. My future husband and the man to whom I pledge my eternal loyalty is the Lycan Prince, Xavier Lockhart. The 5 brothers aggressively held their breath, their highly panicked, deeply terrified hearts violently hammering against their ribs as the devastating words registered. They stared at their deeply fated mate, completely heavily agonizing over the horrific, deeply violent pain they had aggressively caused her. The absolute, highly devastating reality was that she had completely permanently chosen another vastly superior man. The immediate aftermath of her monumental declaration was a profound, suffocating silence that entirely blanketed the grand ballroom. The name of the legendary Lycan Prince carried an incredibly heavy, terrifying weight that instantly demanded absolute respect and profound fear. Whispers rapidly erupted among the pack elders, completely shocked that their adopted daughter had managed to secure an alliance with the most powerful, incredibly elusive royal figure in the entire supernatural world. The sheer magnitude of this highly strategic, deeply political elevation was utterly incomprehensible to the deeply stunned, highly bewildered members of the Stormfin pack. Ethan, completely unable to mentally process the incredibly devastating reality of losing his true fated mate, aggressively lunged toward the grand stage. His eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated panic, completely ignoring the deeply manipulative Omega maid who desperately tried to hold him back. "No, that is absolutely impossible!" Ethan screamed, his voice cracking with intense, highly pathetic desperation. "You are our fated mate. The moon goddess has explicitly chosen you for us. You cannot possibly marry a terrifying faceless monster when you absolutely belong to me. I won't allow this deeply ridiculous arrangement to proceed." Just as Ethan violently attempted to grab the edge of the polished stage, the massive, heavily fortified oak doors of the grand ballroom were aggressively blown completely open by a massive, terrifyingly powerful gust of wind. The temperature in the room instantly plummeted, a profound, deeply freezing aura of absolute, unyielding dominance rapidly filling the massive space. Every single werewolf in the room, including the reigning Alpha Mason, was immediately forcefully compelled to drop their gaze and expose their necks in total undeniable submission. The legendary Lycan Prince had not simply sent a proxy. He had arrived in person to claim his royal bride. Striding incredibly confidently through the massive sea of kneeling, deeply terrified wolves was Xavier Lockhart. He was a towering, incredibly imposing figure of pure, concentrated power, possessing a deeply rugged, devastatingly handsome face that completely shattered the ridiculous rumors of him being a deformed monster. His dark, piercing eyes completely ignored the hundreds of bowing wolves, locking solely and entirely onto the breathtakingly radiant woman standing perfectly still on the grand stage. He exuded an incredibly lethal, profoundly regal aura that definitively proved he was the absolute apex predator of the entire supernatural hierarchy. Xavier effortlessly bypassed the deeply trembling, highly panicked brothers and gracefully ascended the wooden steps of the stage. He gently took Alara's delicate hand in his incredibly large, deeply warm palm, lifting it to his lips in a gesture of profound, absolute reverence. "My beautiful, perfect Luna," Xavier murmured, his incredibly deep, highly resonant voice echoing effortlessly through the massive, silent room. "You are more incredibly radiant than any legend could possibly describe. I have come to permanently take you away from this deeply pathetic, highly toxic place and properly seat you upon my royal throne." The deeply profound, highly intimate display of absolute affection between the terrifying Lycan prince and their fated mate completely broke the last remaining shards of Ethan's sanity. Driven by a blinding, highly suicidal mix of mate-bond frenzy and profound regret, Ethan aggressively shifted his weight, preparing to violently attack the royal sovereign. "She is my mate," Ethan roared, his body trembling violently as he desperately tried to fight the heavy, deeply suffocating suppression of Xavier's overwhelming alpha aura. "You have absolutely no right to take her away from us. We are deeply, permanently bound by the moon goddess herself." Xavier did not even actively turn to face the deeply pathetic, highly aggressive young alpha, with a mere, incredibly casual flick of his heavily ringed hand, a massive, highly concentrated wave of pure, absolute Lycan power violently slammed into Ethan's chest. The incredibly arrogant brother was forcefully thrown backward through the massive ballroom, violently crashing into a heavily decorated stone pillar with a sickening bone-crushing thud. The sheer effortless display of monumental violence instantly silenced any remaining, highly foolish thoughts of rebellion among the deeply terrified Stormfin pack. Xavier's supreme, absolute dominance was entirely, unequivocally established. Slowly turning his dark, piercing eyes toward the severely injured Ethan, Xavier spoke with an incredibly cold, deeply lethal precision. "You speak of the sacred mate bond as if you are absolutely worthy of it," Xavier sneered, his voice dripping with pure, unadulterated disgust. "You completely failed to recognize her immense divine value. You deeply abused her, violently drained her precious, miraculous blood for a highly manipulative, pathetic maid, and treated the greatest gift the moon goddess ever bestowed upon you like absolute disposable garbage. You do not possess the absolute right to even speak her magnificent name." The deeply manipulative Omega maid, Jenny, suddenly sensing the absolute, complete destruction of her deeply luxurious, highly secure life, desperately attempted to interject. She threw herself to the cold marble floor, dramatically fake crying and aggressively claiming she had absolutely no idea the brothers were heavily abusing Alara. But Xavier, possessing deeply enhanced, highly ancient Lycan senses that could easily detect any lie, stared at her with absolute terrifying boredom. He aggressively snapped his fingers, and his heavily armed royal guards immediately dragged a highly terrified rogue wolf into the center of the grand ballroom, instantly exposing Jenny's entire dark past. The captured rogue wolf loudly, frantically confessed to the entire deeply shocked pack that Jenny had heavily paid him to stage the initial, highly manipulative attack in the forest 1 year ago. He explicitly revealed that every single one of her supposed injuries, including the fake, highly dramatic headache that led to Alara's incredibly violent blood draining, was a completely, utterly fabricated lie designed to systematically turn the deeply arrogant brothers against their adopted sister. The monumental, highly devastating truth violently echoed through the silent room, completely and entirely shattering the deeply pathetic, highly toxic illusion the brothers had blindly worshipped. The 5 brothers stared at the sobbing, highly exposed Omega made with complete, unadulterated horror. The immense, heavily blinding veil of toxic infatuation was finally, violently ripped from their deeply foolish eyes. They realized with absolute, profoundly agonizing clarity that they had completely thrown away their incredibly beautiful, deeply fated mate, the powerful woman who had spent 10 years loving them unconditionally, for a deeply sinister, highly manipulative fraud who had been actively, aggressively playing them for absolute, pathetic fools from the very first day. The profound, deeply agonizing weight of their monumental error completely crushed their shattered souls. Alara looked down at the 5 deeply devastated, highly pathetic brothers with an expression of pure, absolute, icy indifference. There was absolutely no anger left in her beautiful, radiant face, only a profound, incredibly deep pity for their supreme, unyielding stupidity. She turned entirely away from them, completely ignoring their highly desperate, incredibly pathetic tears and agonizing pleas for her to stay. She firmly placed her delicate hand into the crook of Xavier's incredibly strong, highly protective arm, signaling that she was completely, absolutely ready to permanently leave the deeply toxic, highly abusive grounds of the Stormfin Pack behind forever. As the deeply terrifying Lycan Prince gracefully escorted his incredibly radiant royal bride out of the massive, completely silent ballroom, the heavy, highly fortified oak doors slowly slammed shut behind them. The resounding, deeply echoing thud served as the absolute, incredibly final death knell for the brothers' tragically squandered destiny. Outside, a massive, highly imposing fleet of heavily armored royal carriages awaited them, entirely surrounded by hundreds of deeply loyal, highly lethal Lycan warriors ready to fiercely protect their newly crowned Luna with their absolute, unwavering lives. The incredibly majestic, deeply triumphant departure was a flawless, cinematic masterpiece of absolute victory. Sitting safely within the highly luxurious, incredibly warm interior of the massive royal carriage, Alara finally allowed herself to completely release a long, deeply shuddering breath. The incredibly intense, highly stressful atmosphere of the Stormfin Pack was rapidly fading away, entirely replaced by the deeply comforting, incredibly profound scent of the Lycan Prince. Xavier gently, incredibly respectfully wrapped his massive, highly protective arm around her trembling shoulders, completely providing the absolute, completely respectfully wrapped his massive, highly protective arm around her trembling shoulders, completely protective arm around her trembling shoulders, completely providing the absolute snanchivicozinj, hitchev, highly protective arm around her trembling shoulders, completely trembling shoulders, completely providing the absolute unwavering safety and deeply profound emotional security she had desperately, incredibly agonizingly craved for her entire deeply tragic existence. Looking deeply into her incredibly beautiful, highly exhausted eyes, Xavier made a profound, deeply solemn vow. He actively promised her that absolutely no one within the vast, incredibly expansive borders of his powerful Lycan kingdom would ever dare disrespect her, manipulate her, or demand the deeply painful sacrifice of her rare, highly divine blood. He explicitly swore to fiercely honor her immense, incredibly brilliant intellect and profoundly deep compassion, treating her not as a deeply subservient, highly obedient possession, but as a completely absolute, highly equal monarch who would proudly, aggressively rule directly by his highly protective side. Back in the deeply depressing, highly toxic ruins of the Stormfin Pack ballroom, absolute, unadulterated chaos had entirely erupted. Alpha Mason, completely horrified and deeply, furiously enraged by the monumental, deeply abusive actions of his incredibly foolish sons, aggressively demanded absolute, strict accountability. He loudly, fiercely stripped all 5 of his deeply arrogant sons of their highly coveted alpha titles, explicitly declaring that absolutely none of them possessed the deep, profound moral character or basic fundamental wisdom required to successfully, adequately lead the highly esteemed pack into the highly uncertain future. The deeply manipulative, highly sinister Omega maid, Jenny, faced the absolute terrifying full brunt of the reigning alpha's incredibly immense, highly explosive wrath. Completely entirely stripped of the deeply foolish brother's blind, highly toxic protection, she was violently, aggressively dragged before the furious pack elders. For her incredibly deep, highly treasonous crimes of malicious deception, severe manipulation, and actively causing immense, deeply near-fatal bodily harm to the Alpha's highly beloved adopted daughter, Jenny was completely permanently banished from the pack territory, aggressively branded as a highly dangerous, deeply treacherous rogue destined to wander the deeply unforgiving wilderness completely alone. The 5 brothers were completely left to aggressively suffer the incredibly profound, deeply agonizing consequences of rejecting their true, absolute fated mate. Stripped entirely of their royal titles and completely deeply haunted by the intoxicating, highly lingering memory of Alara's incredibly sweet scent, they rapidly spiraled into a deeply dark, incredibly inescapable depression. Ethan, completely unable to mentally process the horrific, deeply violent reality that he had personally, aggressively driven away the incredibly beautiful woman destined for his soul, spent his deeply pathetic days heavily drinking and aimlessly wandering the dark, incredibly freezing forest, completely entirely consumed by absolute unyielding despair. As the massive, highly imposing royal convoy finally crossed the heavily fortified, incredibly secure borders into the legendary Lycan Kingdom, Alara was absolutely, completely mesmerized by the sheer, unimaginable magnitude of Xavier's deeply prosperous empire. The sprawling, highly advanced supernatural city was a breathtaking, incredibly majestic masterpiece of ancient, highly Gothic architecture and modern, incredibly efficient innovation. The incredibly deep, highly peaceful atmosphere actively radiating from the incredibly powerful, highly disciplined pack completely entirely validated her incredibly brave, deeply resolute decision to abandon her highly toxic, deeply abusive past. The entire, incredibly massive population of the powerful Lycan Kingdom had actively assembled along the grand, highly decorated cobblestone streets to properly, respectfully welcome their highly anticipated, deeply revered new Luna. Unlike the deeply arrogant, highly disrespectful wolves of her former pack, the incredibly powerful Lycans actively bowed their heads in genuine, highly profound respect as the massive royal carriage slowly passed by. Alara felt a profound, deeply overwhelming sense of absolute, undeniable belonging completely wash over her spirit, entirely realizing she had finally, completely found her absolute, true, and highly permanent home. In the deeply quiet, highly intimate sanctity of the massive, incredibly luxurious royal chambers, Xavier finally completely revealed the profound, highly guarded secret that had forced him to live entirely in the dark, highly isolated shadows. He was actively, deeply burdened by a highly ancient, incredibly deadly magical curse placed upon his royal bloodline centuries ago, a terrifying, highly volatile affliction that aggressively caused immense, deeply agonizing physical pain and dangerously threatened to completely consume his highly powerful Lycan soul. He desperately, heavily confessed that he had originally sought her out highly specifically for the legendary, deeply miraculous healing properties of her divine blood. However, unlike the incredibly arrogant, deeply abusive Ethan, Xavier completely entirely refused to aggressively force or heavily manipulate Alara into actively using her highly draining, deeply precious gift. He fell to his knees before her, profoundly stating that if she absolutely chose not to endure the incredibly deep, highly agonizing physical toll required to actively break the ancient, deeply terrifying curse, he would absolutely, entirely respect her decision and completely love her regardless. He offered her absolute, complete freedom of choice, proving his profound, deeply undeniable devotion to her immense, highly absolute well-being and incredibly pure heart. Deeply moved by the terrifying Lycan Prince's profound, highly uncharacteristic vulnerability and absolute, incredibly unwavering respect, Alara made a conscious, deeply, incredibly brave decision. She was no longer completely acting out of highly desperate, deeply submissive obligation, but out of genuine, highly profound, completely unadulterated love. She gently, incredibly tenderly took Xavier's massive, highly cursed hand in her own, and with absolute, completely unwavering resolve, she deeply willingly offered her rare, incredibly divine blood to the man who had actively, fiercely rescued her from the deep, highly agonizing depths of absolute, profound despair. The profoundly cinematic, incredibly highly magical process of actively breaking the deeply ancient, highly deadly Lycan curse was a breathtaking, completely awe-inspiring display of pure, unadulterated supernatural power. As her highly rare, deeply glowing blood actively mingled with his deeply afflicted, highly cursed veins, a massive, incredibly blinding wave of pure, absolutely divine radiant light completely violently erupted within the massive royal chambers. Permanently and entirely obliterated by the incredibly pure, deeply profound strength of her unconditional, highly sacrificial love. When the incredibly intense, highly blinding light finally completely subsided, Xavier stood completely, absolutely transformed. The deeply agonizing, highly constant physical pain that had aggressively heavily lined his devastatingly handsome face was completely, permanently gone. He pulled Elara into a deeply passionate, incredibly highly profound embrace, actively weeping tears of absolute, profound, incredibly unadulterated joy. By consciously, completely freely choosing to actively heal him, Elara had not merely completely broken the deeply ancient, highly deadly curse. She had completely, permanently, entirely bound their incredibly powerful, deeply immortal souls together for all of absolute, undeniable eternity. Weeks later, the incredibly highly anticipated, massively deeply extravagant royal wedding officially took place in the grand, heavily decorated ancient cathedral of the powerful Lycan kingdom. Elara looked absolutely, incredibly breathtakingly radiant in a massive, highly custom-designed haute couture gown woven from incredibly rare, deeply luminous silk. As she gracefully, highly confidently walked down the massive, deeply polished marble aisle toward the incredibly handsome, perfectly healthy Lycan prince, she actively, completely radiated an aura of absolute, deeply undeniable power and profound, incredibly secure, completely unbreakable absolute happiness. The deeply profound, incredibly majestic exchange of their massive, highly personal royal wedding vows completely, entirely left absolutely not a single dry eye in the entire incredibly massive historical cathedral. They deeply, intensely, openly, explicitly spoke of the dark, highly, profoundly agonizing shadows of their complex past, the incredibly beautiful, deeply magnificent light of their current, absolute, deeply perfect reality, and the absolute, undeniable, highly incredible, unbreakable strength of their deeply, perfectly unified future. When the royal high priest finally deeply officially pronounced them absolutely completely officially bonded as eternal mates, Xavier completely aggressively pulled Elara deeply into an incredibly highly passionate, deeply completely profound, absolutely soul-shattering kiss that deeply loudly echoed completely throughout the grand hall, sealing their magnificent destiny forever. Following the deeply magnificent, highly incredible, globally celebrated royal wedding, King Xavier and Queen Alara aggressively, completely immediately resumed their deeply powerful, highly absolute, completely undeniable roles as the absolute, completely undisputed rulers of the supernatural landscape. They effortlessly projected an incredibly unified, absolutely deeply impenetrable front that entirely terrified their deeply aggressive enemies and completely inspired their massive legions of loyal subjects. Under their combined deeply highly incredibly brilliant leadership, the massive Lycan kingdom entered an unprecedented, highly prosperous era of absolute, deeply profound global peace.